Hey guys! So far this semester, we've done a little bit of work talking about what makes a good argument. So not only how to recognize a good argument, but also how to build a good argument in support of a given conclusion. We know that in a good argument, the content should be good. That is, we want the premises in our arguments to be true. But having true premises is only one condition for being a good argument. To see why this is the case, let's look at an example about my friend Chuck. Chuck is a human being. That's going to matter in just a minute. So we have the sample argument on the board. And it reads, if Chuck is a human, then Chuck is a mammal. Chuck is a mammal, therefore Chuck is a human. So I want to pause here and make a note of the way that this argument is written on the board. As you can see, I've written the premises listed one after the other, and I've separated the premises from the conclusion by drawing this line. This is how we're going to write arguments for the rest of this class. So remember this structure, that the premises are on top, the conclusion is on the bottom, and they're divided by a line. So we have premises 1 and 2, and we have our conclusion here. So anytime you see an argument written this way, with a line like this, you know exactly where to look to find the premises and the conclusion. I'm going to erase these for now, but you can make a note in your notebooks to help you remember. Okay, so we know what my premises are. Are they true? Well, the first premise is, if Chuck is a human, then Chuck is a mammal. That's true. It doesn't even actually matter who or what Chuck is. The premise is true. You're saying, if Chuck was a human, then Chuck would be a mammal. All humans are mammals, so we just know that that's true. The second premise is Chuck is a mammal. Well, now I've told you that we're talking about my human friend Chuck. Chuck is a mammal. So both the premises are true. And the conclusion is true. I just told you we're talking about my human friend Chuck. The conclusion is, therefore, Chuck is a human. So our argument reads, if Chuck is a human, then Chuck is a mammal. Chuck is a mammal, therefore, Chuck is a human. Premises are true, and the conclusion is true. But something is weird here. Some of you might have already caught on to the fact that this isn't a good argument. But the premises are true, and the conclusion is true. So what happens? Well, when we evaluate an argument, we want to look at whether or not it says true things, but we also need to look at the form or the structure of the argument. And this argument here has the wrong form, meaning that the way that we structured it isn't very good. So we need to pay attention to the form of an argument. And this is actually the first thing we want to look at when we evaluate an argument, because as we just saw, if the form of an argument is bad, then it doesn't really matter if the premises are true. So we know that a good argument has to meet two conditions, or rather, it has to have two properties. One, the form has to be good, and in logic, when an argument has a good form, we say that it's valid. Second, the argument has to have true premises. In logic, when an argument is valid, so it has the right form, and it has true premises, we say that the argument is sound. One thing that you should be picking up on is that in order for an argument to be sound, it first has to be valid. Let's get a visual aid up here to help us remember that all sound arguments must be valid. So I'm going to draw a circle here, and that represents all of the arguments that exist. So I wrote the letter A to help us remember that this circle represents the set of all arguments that exist. Some arguments are valid, so let's draw a circle inside this one, right? These are all of the valid arguments. So we have the set of all arguments that exist, and a subset of the set of all arguments that exist is the arguments that are valid. So inside the valid arguments, we have another subset, and that's the arguments that are sound. So out of all the arguments in the world, some of them are valid. And out of all the valid arguments that exist, some of those are sound. But it's not possible to have a sound argument that isn't valid. If your argument is sound, it also has to be valid. Consider it in relation to a sort of similar setup. So I'm going to draw here the set of all mammals, right? So we have M for mammals. This is the set of all mammals. Well, some subset of mammals are humans. So inside this set of mammals, we have this set of mammals that are human. We also have, let's say, the subset of mammals that are whales. So we have different subsets of mammals. In the subset of all mammals that are human, there's another really, really small subset of just my friend Chuck, right? So out of all the mammals, some of those mammals are humans. And out of all of those human mammals, one of them is my friend Chuck. But Chuck is a teeny tiny subset of all of the humans, which is a subset of all the mammals. But in order to be my friend Chuck, you have to be a human. In order to be a human, you have to be a mammal. In order to be a sound argument, you must be valid. And in order to be a valid argument, of course, you have to be an argument. So this can be something that's a little bit tricky to remember, the idea that all sound arguments have to be valid, and hopefully that visual aid gives you a little bit of something to latch on to remember that. Okay, so our properties for a good argument are validity and soundness, and we have a vague idea about what those properties are. Now let's explore the definitions of those terms. We'll start with validity. So an argument is valid when it has a good formal structure. Formal as in pertaining to the form, not formal like fancy. So it has to have the right formal structure. But what does that mean? What is the good or right form for an argument? Well, what we want from the form of an argument is for the form to make it the case that if the premises were true, then it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. If an argument has a good form, then if the premises are true, it's gotta be the case that the conclusion would be true too. In a valid argument, the conclusion just follows from the premises. So here's our definition of a valid argument. An argument is valid if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So let's look back at our argument. It said, if Chuck is a human, then Chuck is a mammal. Chuck is a mammal, therefore Chuck is a human. Okay, so we already established that the premises were actually true, but with validity, we don't really need to know whether they're actually true. What we just care about is, hypothetically, if the premises were true, would it be possible for the conclusion to be false? If so, then the argument isn't valid. So we'll say, okay, it's true that if Chuck is a human, then Chuck is a mammal. And let's say that it's true that Chuck is a mammal. Is it possible for these premises to be true but for the conclusion to be false? Is it possible for these premises to be true and yet Chuck actually isn't a human? Or to use another word from our first video, is there a counterexample to this argument? Well, let's see. What if Chuck was a dog? In fact, Chuck is the name of one of my dogs, and she makes a perfect counterexample for this argument. Even if the Chuck in this argument wasn't my friend Chuck, but was my dog Chuck, even if it's dog Chuck, we could still have the premises be true and yet the conclusion be false. Yeah, so we see that these premises just aren't good enough to support the conclusion. It's possible for these premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, like if we were talking about my dog Chuck. So this argument is not valid. Okay, so this argument isn't valid because it doesn't have the right form. Can we use all of these same propositions to construct an argument that is valid? How would we do that? Okay, well, we'll need to do something to our premises. Let's leave the first premise intact and focus on the second. I'm going to erase that here. And I'm also going to erase our conclusion. So our second premise was Chuck is a mammal. What's another proposition that we can use instead of that for our second premise? Let's go with Chuck is a human. That's our other proposition in this premise. So we'll say if Chuck is a human, then Chuck is a mammal is one premise. And we'll say Chuck is a human. That's our second premise. Awesome. So what should our conclusion be? Our conclusion should be, therefore, Chuck is a mammal. And it's not arbitrary that I decided that that should be our conclusion. In fact, if you look at this, you'll see that If these premises are true, it has to be the case that the conclusion is true. If it's true that if Chuck is a human, then Chuck is a mammal, and if it's true that Chuck is a human, then it has to be true that Chuck is a mammal. There's just no other way for things to be. It's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And that's exactly what we wanted. So we have a really good form here. This argument is valid. Awesome. Okay, so we've covered validity, but what about our other property that a good argument should have? Remember that when we're talking about validity, we're only concerned with the form of an argument and not the content. We say that an argument is valid if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. But we're not saying anything about whether the premises are actually true. It's the other property of a good argument, soundness, that is concerned with whether or not the premises are actually true. An argument is valid if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. An argument is sound if it's valid and the premises are actually true. So here's your definition of soundness. An argument is sound if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, and if the premises actually are true. This gets a little bit tricky, so let's come up with an analogy to help us keep this straight. Think about this in relation to constructing a building. When you construct a building, first someone comes up with a blueprint, and that blueprint will tell you how to put something together and what materials to use. Then the crew comes along, and they gather a bunch of materials and they try to put the building up. If they follow the structure on the blueprint and they use the right materials, then the building will stand. If they decide to cut costs and use Play-Doh instead of steel or whatever the right material was, then the building will fall down, even if they're following the structure outlined on the blueprint. So on the one side, you have the blueprint, which tells you, hypothetically, how you can construct a building given the right materials. And on the other side, you have the crew assembling materials, and if they're using the right materials, they'll build a sound structure. So validity is like the blueprint, and soundness is like the materials. Validity tells you how you would hypothetically build a good argument if you filled it in with the right stuff. When you have a valid argument structure, and then you construct the actual argument with the right materials, that is, if you use premises that are actually true, then you'll have a sound argument. And that's a lovely thing. So again, validity concerns the form of an argument, and soundness concerns the form and the truth of its premises. So for this unit, we're going to focus just on the formal stuff for the most part. There's two reasons we want to start with the form. Like we said, if the form is wrong, then we don't even need to worry about whether the premises are actually true or not. We already know it's a bad argument. But another reason to start with the form is that the content of the argument can sometimes confuse us or distract us away from evaluating the form. So we're just going to start with the form, and to keep things simpler, most of the time we're going to use variables instead of writing out the content of the arguments. This will help us stay focused on the form and not be distracted by whether or not the premises are actually true. So we're going to take small chunks of our sentences and put in some variables to hold their place. The convention in logic is to start by using the letters P and Q as variables, instead of X and Y or A and B. So let's turn back to our argument on the board. It says, if Chuck is a human, then Chuck is a mammal. Chuck is a human, therefore Chuck is a mammal. So let's write this in a new way, in order to focus only on the form of the argument and not get distracted by the content. I'm going to use P to stand in for the phrase, Chuck is a human, and I'm going to use Q to stand in for the phrase, Chuck is a mammal. What do you think this argument's going to look like after I use the variables? All right, let's see. I'm using P to stand in for Chuck is a human and Q to stand in for Chuck is a mammal. So we will write this, if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. This is a valid structure. In fact, It's known as modus ponens, and it's really cool, and we're going to talk about that more in another video. I'll write that up here so you know and you can recognize it when we get to it. This is modus ponens. Okay, cool. So to sum up this video, when we evaluate an argument, we look at two properties, validity and soundness. Validity is a formal property of an argument, meaning it pertains to the argument's form or structure. An argument is valid if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. An argument is sound if it's valid and the premises are actually true. For this unit, we're going to be looking at the form or the structure of arguments more than the content. And to make this easier, we're going to use variables like this to help us focus on the form of our arguments and not the content. Okay, that's it for our introduction on validity and soundness. Let me know if you have any questions.